Welcome to Contemporary First Nation Voices. This is NBE3C, Grade 11 English, College Level, and this is Jillian Percy. Today is Class 17, and we are going to be working on key question number 27. Okay, ways to contact. The studio number is 1-800-465-7144. The office phone number is 1-800-667-3703, and the extension is 2211. If you want to email me, jillian.percy@nnec.on.ca. That is the most reliable way to reach me. I have that tab open all the time, and it automatically notifies me when somebody emails me, and I check that constantly throughout the day. Facebook, I do check that, but I generally check it like maybe once a day in the morning, so I don't necessarily see it right away. It is supposed to send me a little email that somebody has messaged me, but it doesn't always seem to work. If you send me a Facebook message, please make sure you do a friend request as well. And let me know what your proper name is, like what you'll be in our database, and what course you're in so I know what to help you with, okay? And then it will look like this. It'll be capital G, capital P, ERCY, space, capital W, AHSA. And then there are two different YouTube channels that you can watch the previous courses on. One is my teacher channel, which is the same name as Facebook, G. Percy Wassa, and there should be a playlist that has the NBE3C stuff on. Do not look at the previous NBE3C that was taught by a different teacher, and it is a little bit different than what I'm teaching this year, so that might mix you up. We also have a school channel that has all the classes from all the teachers, but only from this year. So it should be the same thing. It's just that I post at one time and my boss might post a different time. If a class has been recorded, just check either one, or you can always give me a little nudge if you don't see it. Okay. Handing in assignments. This is what I get asked the most, and there are just multiple ways to do this. If you are at a community that has a learning center, you can always give it to the DEC, ask them to scan it and send it to me. Always hang on to your originals. Things get lost or go missing. Plus, for a lot of the courses, there is a portfolio project at the end, and you'll want to have your originals for that. You can always fax it to us, 1-800-463-7852. That's if you're in Ontario, or 1-877-990-2023. That is if you're anywhere else in the country but not Ontario. Now, you can scan it yourself using a scanner app on the phone and then send it to me through email. I will show you how to do that in a minute. Mail it to me. This is not my recommended way, but it can happen. Be absolutely sure that you hang on to the originals and you only send me the copies. But keep in mind, this takes a long time and things do sometimes get lost. So it's got to get here. It might take 2 or 3 weeks to get to me. Then it's going to go to my marking pile. It might take 2 or 3 weeks to get to that. It can be really a frustrating way to do it. So I don't recommend it, but if it's the only way you've got, then that's what you do. Share documents with me through Google Docs. A lot of times, if it's a typed assignment, people will do that. Just make sure to include me as somebody who's able to edit. I won't actually edit your work. I won't do that, but that way I'm available to be able to see it. And the last thing is handing assignments in by photograph through Facebook or email. Now, I'm going to say this is not my recommended way unless you're only handing in a page or two. If you're handing in 20 pages worth of assignments, this is a difficult way to do it. I got to be honest with you. Make sure your photo is clear, not blurry. You have to be able to read the writing. Preferably, you've written your assignment in ink, so it's dark enough for me to read. Pencil can be very hard to read on photographs for some reason. The photograph must be taken with a phone parallel to the assignment so that the writing does not get distorted. Please do not just click the share button. It comes up as an odd size on the computer because it's meant to go to another phone that way, and I'm not on a phone. Also, don't just paste it into the body of the email. Instead, save it as a file, attach it to the email, and that comes up at a proper size, and it's really easy for me to print off. Whenever you hand in work, always send it to this email, studentwork@nnec.on.ca. You can include me in the email if you want to be doubly safe, but when you do this, the secretary knows that you've done it. She logs that it's been committed, that it's been done. It goes in the database. If something happened to me, anybody can see it, and they can go into the student work email and pull it back up if it's needed, okay? On the actual physical assignment, write your full name, the course name, the assignment name and number. Especially there's things like journal, and there's like 20 journals in that course. I got to know the number and I have to know the name. There's also times where there's assignments that might be really similar. Like I had one that was like learning process, and there was another one that was learning progress. And they're kind of similar concepts, but they're a little bit different. So it's important to have the name on there too, okay? If an assignment asks for both a rough and a good draft, please label which one is which and include them both in the same email. I always look because I want to see what kind of progress you've made and what kind of changes you've made in your editing. Okay, this is how to scan documents using your phone. Now, this is based on Adobe Scanner. That is the one I've used because it's free. Adobe's a really reliable company. It's pretty easy to use, and as you can see, they've got a nice handy little step-by-step, which makes it even easier. But if you don't want to use Adobe Scan for some reason, you can use whatever scanner app you wish. It's just this step-by-step may not work just as well, okay? Basically, first of all, install it onto your phone, then open it up, hold your phone over the file. Now, they've got theirs on a funny angle. Don't put it on an angle. Put it right directly over. After you're scanning, make sure the borders are where you want them. Obviously, you don't need to include your table. If you took it on your table, just kind of narrow it in so it's just the actual paper. If you've got another page to scan, you just keep doing that 2 and 3 over and over and over again until you've got all the pages in that you need. Tap continue when you're done. At that point, you can preview what you've done. You can check and see, is it blurry? Is it out of order? Did I accidentally cut off a corner? If you don't like anything, you can do it over. If you do like it all, now you can save the PDF, give it a name like assignment number 13, save it either in your Google Drive, your Dropbox, or your computer or your phone, whatever you want to save it to, and then write me an email and send it that way. That gets the best pictures. It works much better than just taking a photograph because it knows it's doing printing. So I just get a better quality basically. Okay, so we are on week 5. Don't forget that next week is March break, and nobody will be here on March break, not even the secretary. So there's nobody here to answer phones. If you are planning to do a whole bunch of work over March break, like a lot of students do, and you have any questions, kind of take a look ahead at what you're planning to do. Give me a phone call or shoot me an email this week so that I can see it, okay? Um, this is always a tentative schedule. Hopefully we'll get finished Unit 2 this week. That's my plan. And then after March break, we'll come back and we'll start working on Unit 3. Tentatively, that's what I'm hoping to do. Now, some of these assignments may not 100% match up with what you've got because I have eliminated some assignments that were unnecessary. I've changed a few to make them match the criteria a little bit more, and I've added a few assignments where some things were missing, okay? You're welcome to hand in the original, though, or the revised version until the end of this school year. If you are watching this and it is September 2025, however, make sure you call me and get the original immediately. Even if you're watching it right now, I strongly suggest getting the revised version. It's really just a much better version all the way around. Okay, Unit 2 is all about storytelling, and then right now we are on Lesson 9. Okay, in this lesson you're going to read an essay, look at some of the artwork, and look at 1 or 2 children's stories that deal with cultural traditions and beliefs. We've already discussed how important traditions are in Indigenous cultures. Read the article below and see how Canadian Indigenous writers and publishing houses are working together to preserve and express the knowledge, traditions, and culture of Indigenous people through children's books. Okay, so this is an actual article. I did not write this. This is someone else who wrote this. The title of the article is called Turning the Page, Indigenous Languages in Children's Books by Teonre Hote, or also known as Dan David, published on November 3rd, 2019. I flipped through the pages of 3 children's books on my kitchen table. Kimotanawiwe Itewenwena, Stolen Words, which we talked about yesterday, I believe, is in the Y Dialect Plains Cree. I Am Not a Number, which is also called, we also have the Water Walker, are both in Ojibwe. I can only try to explain how amazing it feels for me to write a sentence like that, or why it's so important to do so. Stolen Words is what I call a wish story about a young girl who asks her grandfather to say something in their Cree language. He can't and explains that teachers at a prairie residential school had stolen it. She decides to help him find his language again with the gift of a found dictionary in Cree. I Am Not a Number is a true story about a young girl's experiences at another residential school, this time in Northern Ontario. Jenny K. Dupuis co-writes this story with Kathy Kaser. Jenny's Ojibwe grandmother, Irene, was 8 years old when an Indian agent took her and her two brothers to residential school. They return after a year to their parents with stories of abuse and neglect. Teachers punished them for speaking their language and replaced their names with numbers. Irene's number was 759. The parents refused to surrender their children to the Indian agent ever again in this touching story of resistance and resilience. The Water Walker is written by Joanne Robertson. It's about an Ojibwe woman who decided to do something to protect a necessity of life, water. Nokomis Josephine Mandamin sets out on annual walks along streams, rivers, and finally around the Great Lakes to warn people that water, life itself, needs protection from polluters. It's the story of one woman's environmental activism and the birth of a political movement. All three books are examples of a relatively new effort to publish children's books in dual languages. Dual just means two. But the stories they tell are just as important. These are stories about Canada and its history, stories about Indigenous peoples that were buried, suppressed, and denied, but now these stories are finally being told and taught in schools across Canada. Stories that hit home. Until grade 4, I attended the day school at Kanasataki near the town of Oka. In all that time, I never saw a word in my own language. In fact, we were punished for speaking Mohawk at school. Like many Indigenous peoples my age, I never learned my own language or my own story. The only book I remember reading at the day school was Fun with Dick and Jane, which was as foreign to me as anything in Mandarin Chinese. I spoke English. With endless repetition, I learned to read Run, Dick, Run. I also remember my friends in class laughing at this and other books with their illustrated characters because they looked, dressed, and acted like nothing in our lives. Much later, I learned these books were designed to impress upon our young minds an idealized model that we were expected to adopt so we might assimilate into Canadian society. Of course, we never could or would because if we were very lucky, we learned to accept our differences, learn our own history, and be proud of our own heritage. If we weren't lucky, we lost our identities and wandered without hope as cultural refugees in our own lands. We had other children's books at school, of course, but if they portrayed Indigenous peoples at all, they were written, illustrated, and published by people with little or no real knowledge of Indigenous peoples, who seemed disinterested in cultural accuracy. Few questioned the familiar colonial myths. Every Canadian child was raised on similar cowboys and Indians tropes found in virtually every playground at the time. Even if there were children's books that told stories closer to my reality, I doubt we would have been able or allowed to read them in school. But the fact is, books like that just weren't around. This was a time before terms like multiculturalism or diversity entered public conversation, and long before Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission pointed a stern finger at teachers and publishers for excluding Indigenous realities from children's education. Residential schools constituted an assault on Aboriginal children, families, self-governing Aboriginal nations, and culture. The impacts of the residential school system were immediate and have been ongoing since the earliest years of the schools. Canadians have been denied a full and proper education as to the nature of Aboriginal societies and the history of the relationship between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people. Hang on. Children's book of the day called Indigenous people Indians and Eskimos. Métis didn't even appear. We lived in teepees or igloos. rode horses and dog sleds, and lived exoticized lives. Colonial myths erased the great diversity of indigenous languages and cultures and replaced their differences with cartoonish stereotypes. Canadian children's books portrayed indigenous peoples more like characters from Disneyland. I want to say Disney movies. This is a little tiny clip of a cartoon from Peter Pan. I do not recommend watching that with your children if you have not yet watched it. It is incredibly negatively stereotyped against First Nations people. But that kind of representation was very common and widely seen when I was a kid on all sorts of cartoons and movies and all that kind of stuff. And I'm not really that old. A new page. Second Story Press in Toronto published these and other books written by Indigenous women in both English and an Indigenous language. Emma Rogers, the manager of marketing and promotions, tells me it seemed a logical, if uncertain, next step. They had already published Indigenous writers, but only in English. After Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission published its report recommending that books, and especially children's books, be published in Indigenous languages such as Plains Cree and Ojibwe as well, they decided that this dual language publishing was the right thing to do. But would it cover the costs? Initially, we thought this would be a small print run, that the majority of readers would be in the Indigenous communities where these languages were spoken, Rogers explained. Over the past several years, our sales representatives saw a growing interest among non-Indigenous readers, especially in education and libraries. The further along we got in the process, the more confident we felt that there would be a wide audience for these books. We can assume the majority of readers will have no experience with these languages, so they will be able to see these printed languages, have a little interaction with them for the very first time, said Rogers. The point is to make Indigenous languages and cultures in Canada bizarrely less foreign and more familiar to young readers. It's part of a global movement to save Indigenous languages from extinction, an effort that's having a bit of a moment. The United Nations has declared 2019 the Year of Indigenous Languages. But part of that means encouraging governments and their agencies to understand that it's about more than just language, it's about the cultural rights of Indigenous peoples too. UNESCO, the UN's social and cultural arm, says Indigenous peoples are often isolated, both politically and socially, in the countries they live in, by the geographical location of their communities, their separate histories, cultures, languages, and traditions. And yet, they are not only leaders in protecting the environment, but their languages represent complex systems of knowledge and communication and should be recognized as strategic national resource for development, peace building, and reconciliation. What strikes me as amazing, however, that it's much more than just printing and publishing children's books in Indigenous languages. It's that these books are written by Indigenous people, telling their own stories in their own way to teach children about their cultures, their values, and their other ways of viewing the world. They have helped to broaden and expand the narrow and monochromatic view of the world that had been taught to every child of my generation. I wanted to know what other Indigenous readers thought about the books, and if anyone else felt the way I did about them. I spoke to Shirley Williams, one of the Anishinaabemowin Ojibwe translators of the Water Walker. She showed this book to some of the students she works with in Indigenous Studies at Trent University in Peterborough, Ontario. People have told me that this is wonderful, she says. This is very good. It's really needed. PhD students, for example. People who knew Josephine say the book touched them. She was a well-known person because of her walks around the Great Lakes. It's these personal connections to the stories written and translated by Indigenous people who knew the writers or shared the same experiences that makes books like these popular among non-Indigenous readers too. They certainly speak to me in a way that I can relate to, even if I don't understand Plains Cree or Ojibwe, and maybe they will to you too. Tayanre Hote Dan David is a recovering journalist, baker of bread, and aging cyclist. He is based at Kanahasataka, Mohawk Territory near Oka. The original article is there. There's the clip. Um, I before working here at WASA, I previously worked in an elementary school, so we were always anxious to get books that had been written in Ojibwe as well as English, and that is becoming more and more common. What I've seen a few times is where um, the two different ways. Either one of the languages is at the top of the page and one of the languages at the bottom, or it'll be a two-page spread with like a picture that goes across both, and English will be on one side and the indigenous language will be on the other. And if anyone in town is looking for those, by the way, I'm just going to put a quick pitch in here for Kaiwichian. Also has those kind of books that are locally written, that can be purchased in a variety of different indigenous languages if you are out there looking for those. We don't necessarily have a bookstore of like a lot of children's books in town. There is the hub as well, but that's another place that you could get some children's books in indigenous languages if you were looking for it. Okay, so support question number 11. Remember that support questions are not for marks. They're just to kind of get us thinking about what we were just reading. So in addition to being about Indigenous people, what is new about the Indigenous children's books that are being published today? Well, the big thing is that they are adding Indigenous languages to them, right? There are even some books that you can get that are entirely in Indigenous languages. What are at least two events that were the catalyst for this new trend in children's books? So in case you weren't sure, catalyst is an object, person, event that creates a significant change. So what created this change that suddenly publishers are publishing books in Indigenous languages? Well, there were kind of two things. I don't know if I can find everything exactly. Hang on a sec. Okay, so Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission published a specific report saying one of their recommendations was please start printing children's books in Indigenous languages. And publishers basically listened. They went ahead and did that. Hang on a sec. The other thing, United Nations declared 2019 the Year of Indigenous Languages. That was another thing. I think that was the two main things. Okay, hang on a second. Okay, how has this change affected Indigenous readers? Well, that entire article was written by somebody who was Indigenous, and they were saying how amazing it was to see the kind of books available for children now that they wish had been available when they were kids. Yesterday, we looked at an infographic that talked about the continued lack of variety in children's books and how predominantly it is still English being portrayed. And the key word they talk a lot about these days is representation, right? Everybody, but especially children, need to see people who look like themselves in the books they read. Otherwise, it's like they're invisible or they don't count, right? So having books that do represent Indigenous people and Indigenous lives is a huge thing to help children's self-esteem and help them want to read. Like, why would you want to read if you don't see yourself in those books? There's no point. How has this change been received by non-Indigenous readers? Well, one thing the publishing company was saying was, they had a lot more requests for books than they thought. They thought they would be only selling to Indigenous people, and that has not happened. Teachers have been interested, libraries have been interested, and just in general, people have been interested. I think maybe sometimes people are unaware of there are a lot of Indigenous people that don't necessarily live on reserves, and especially down south, may not necessarily have kind of what people think of as the typical Indigenous look. So people may not even be aware, right? And they suddenly see, hey, there's books about me. There's books about my mom, my dad, my family. and it's kind of been a cool thing. Okay, so moving on. Question 27, Remembering Traditions. Okay, so this next book that we're going to be reading about is about dream catchers. Before you start reading the book, write down at least 3 things that you already know about dream catchers. Okay, and this is one of those things where, again, we talk a lot about this, but for some questions, there is no right answer. So it doesn't matter to me what you know. You could know loads. You could have made them. You might be very skilled at that. Maybe you make them and sell them even. Or you might know nothing. And that's okay. Just tell me 3 things to kind of get your brain kind of moving and thinking about what you know that you think is important about dream catchers. Okay? We've talked about before. That's one of those reading strategies called activating background knowledge, where you kind of, it's like you give your brain a little kickstart because we learn new information best when we link it to information we already know. So that's why I'm saying think about what you already know to help yourself. So this is a Wikipedia article, which I don't normally use, but I did this case because I think it's a pretty typical summary of what most people tend to think they know about dream catchers. There's some things in here that I hadn't heard of, but a lot of it is very similar to what I would have thought was true about dream catchers. The picture there, if you're seeing it, is a little tiny dream catcher, clearly handmade, that is in the Royal Ontario Museum. Okay, so sorry, hang on a second, about to cough here. Sorry about that. In some Native American and First Nations culture, a dream catcher is a handmade willow loop on which is woven a net or a web. It may be decorated with sacred items such as certain feathers or beads. Traditionally, dream catchers are hung over a cradle or a bed as protection. It originates in Anishinaabe culture as the spider web charm, which is a hoop with woven string or sinew meant to replicate a spider's web and used as a protective charm for infants. Dream catchers were adopted in the Pan-Indian movement of the 1960s and 1970s and gained popularity as widely marketed native craft items in the 1980s. The Ojibwe origin. Ethnographer Francis Desmore in 1929 recorded an Ojibwe legend according to which the spider web's protective charms originate with Spider Woman, known as Shibakashi, who takes care of the children and the people on the land. As the Ojibwe nation spread to the corners of North America, it became difficult for her to reach all the children, so the mothers and grandmothers weave webs for the children using willow hoops and sinew or cordage made from plants. The purpose of these charms is apotropaic and not explicitly connected with dreams. I'm not 100% sure what that word is. I'll have to look it up in a minute. Even infants were provided with protective charms. Examples of these are spider webs hung on the hoop of a cradle board. In old times, this netting was made of nettle fiber. 2 spider webs were usually hung on the hoop, and it was said that they caught any harm that might be in the air, as spiders' web catches and holds whatever comes in contact with it. Basil Johnson, an elder from Nayashkinakemin, in his Ojibwe Heritage book written in 1976, gives the story as a trickster figure catching a snake in his web. Hang on a second. Modern uses. While dream catchers continue to be used in a traditional manner in their communities and cultures of origin, derivative forms of dream catchers were adopted into the Pan-Indian movement of the 1960s and 1970s as a symbol of unity among the various Native American cultures, or as a general symbol of identification with Native American or First Nations cultures. The name Dreamcatcher was published in mainstream non-native media in the 1970s and became widely known as a native crafts item by the 1980s. By the 1990s, it was one of the most popular and marketable ones, marketable meaning like sellable. In the course of becoming popular outside the Ojibwe Nation and outside the Pan-Indian communities, various types of dream catchers, many of which bear very little resemblance to traditional styles, and that incorporate materials that would not be traditionally used, are now made, exhibited, and sold by New Age groups and individuals. Many Native Americans have come to see these imitation dream catchers as over-commercialized, offensively misappropriated and misused by non-natives. And they talk about one that is more appropriate. There's a mounted and framed dream catcher being used as a shared symbol of hope and healing by the Little Thunderbirds drum and dance troupe from the Red Lake Indian Reservation in Minnesota, in recognition of the shared trauma and loss experienced both at their school during the Red Lake shootings and by other students who have survived similar school shootings. They have traveled to other schools to meet with students, share songs and stories, and gift them with the Dreamcatcher. The Dreamcatcher has been passed from Red Lake to students in several other towns where school shootings have occurred. So I haven't heard of all that kind of stuff, but I just kind of wanted to share that as that's what's out there right now. Remember, we've talked about using Wikipedia and how it's often the very first thing that will come up in a search, but that it's not always considered 100% reliable. And as we're talking today, you're going to kind of see a little bit one of the reasons why. Read the text called Story of the Dreamcatcher by Xavier Cataquepet on page 124 of your textbook called Strength and Struggle. As you're reading, jot down at least 3 to 5 new or interesting things that you learn about dreamcatchers. Okay. When I was growing up in Attawapiskat, I rarely had the opportunity to learn about Native culture and traditions. We were brought up with a spiritual belief that was really more religious and based on the Roman Catholic faith. The missionaries had brought this belief to the people of the James Bay coast and to Native people right across North and South America. I did not really understand when I was young that it had not always been that way. It was surprising to me that we had a spiritual way, culture, and traditions before the coming of the Europeans. My elders have been able to tell me something about those days, but most of my learning has come from traditional elders, healers, medicine men, and people who have a more intricate knowledge of the ancestors. This summer, I learned much about dreamcatchers from Marcia Martel Brown of Brunswick House First Nation. I met her at the annual Wabun Youth Gathering where she was sharing teachings on the dreamcatcher. My first knowledge of the dreamcatcher is similar, I imagine, to most other people. I always thought they were just native craft work that had something to do with keeping bad dreams away. Actually, the true origins of the dreamcatcher have to do with healing and the complex process that revolved around the making of this item. Marcia explained that our ancestors used the making of the dreamcatcher as part of a healing journey. Long ago, when Native people had a better understanding of their own spirituality, culture, and traditions, the dreamcatcher was an important tool for a community. If someone was feeling emotional or physical pain, he or she might choose to go on a healing journey that involved the making of a dream catcher. This person would contact a healer or a medicine man in the community and ask for assistance on this journey. A person would have to get permission from his or her family because the family would have to survive without the constant presence and help from the person seeking healing. Once there was agreement, the seeker of healing worked closely with the healer to learn the ways of dealing with or healing a hurt. Marcia explained that this was a big deal in a community. When someone decided to go on a healing journey and began making a dream catcher, it was up to the community to support the person and the family. The community would pitch in so that both the person and the family would survive while the journey was taken. The entire community knew about the journey, and there was a huge feast to celebrate the decision. Once the journey started, the person on the healing quest and the healer spent much time together. There was no set time limit for this process, and sometimes it took seasons and even years to complete. It all started with hunting and gathering to find the items to make a dream catcher. Some of these items included willow branches, sinew, stone, and various other items as decided on by the healer. They traveled out in the land to hunt and gather what they needed. During this time, they spent days and days together discussing the life history of the person on the quest. The dream catcher then started to take form. First, the selected willow branch was bent either to cross or meet in a circle. This represented the person's beginning of life to the present and all that happened in that time. Then, slowly, the healer helped the person produce the sinew and string inside it the circle like ribbons of time. In the slow and patient construction of the dream catcher, stones and other items would be hooked into the emerging web of sinew. These might represent significant events and perhaps times of pain. After much time, work, and reflection on life, the person on the dream quest would arrive at a place of learning with a finished dream catcher. This was always the hope. At this point, at that point, this part of the healing journey came to an end. A new beginning was celebrated in a ceremony. The dream catcher was burned, and the pain and turmoil that had been hurting the person seeking healing disappeared in the flames. That last part of Marcia's explanation helped me understand why our people never had proof or evidence of dream catchers from long, long ago. None of them survived, as they were given over to an important part of the healing process when they were burned. So I say a big miigwech to Marcia for bringing me the story of the dreamcatcher so that I, in turn, could tell it to you. I wish you sweet dreams. Okay, so number 3. What is the connection between the dream catcher and the healing journey? Number 4. How does the information in this story compare with what you already knew about dream catchers? Do you agree or disagree with what the author shares? Now again, this is one of those no right, wrong answers, okay? It's fine if what you've heard or what your family or your community celebrates and believes in is different, that's fine. If you've been told a different story about the meaning, customs, or heritage of dream catchers, this is the place to let me know what you've been told. One of the big aspects of this course is the concept that there is a wide diversity of viewpoints and perspectives about Indigenous customs and traditions due to the differences between the different languages and tribal groups and bands. So it's quite possible that in one group it was kind of mostly thought of in one day, and maybe in another group it was thought of as in a different way. So let me know how it was thought of in your family or community. Number 5, in your opinion, what was the author's purpose in writing this story? Do you think this article was effective or successful in reaching this goal? Explain your reasons for feeling like this article was or was not effective. Okay, so first of all, what do I mean when we ask if writing is effective? This is kind of a tricky concept. Effective is defined as being successful at producing a desired or intended result. So in order to decide if a piece of writing is effective, you kind of have to look at what was the author trying to achieve? What result were they hoping for? And sometimes the author will tell you directly, right in their story or their article, but other times you kind of have to draw your own conclusion. What could the author be trying to achieve in their writing? Okay, so any author, just not talking about this particular one, but any particular author, there's 3 main overall goals. We've talked about this many times: to inform, to persuade, or to entertain. However, as we've also talked about, sometimes they are combining these goals together, or there's kind of an underlying cultural goal that we don't always think of as connecting to one of those 3 main goals. But a lot of those cultural goals, which we talked about before, could be categorized as belonging to these main 3 goals if you think about it. So I kind of put together a little chart of some of the things we've talked about before to show you some of the possibilities. So to inform could be things like to let people know about a cultural practice or tradition, to reveal laws, customs, or attitudes that are doing harm to Indigenous people, to inform people about Indigenous lives and experiences that they may not know about, to explain how to correctly do an Indigenous ceremony, custom, or activity, to persuade. To persuade is when you're trying to convince somebody to do something different or believe something different. So you could be trying to convince people to change their attitude towards a cultural practice or tradition. You could be trying to persuade those in authority to change a law or a regulation that is harming Indigenous people or culture. You could be trying to encourage Indigenous peoples to have more positive feelings about their own heritage or their own traditions. You could be trying to persuade non-Indigenous people to have more sympathy for the hardships that Indigenous people have endured. To entertain, this is the one I found kind of hardest, so I hope what I've written makes sense. To share a traditional story that has been traditionally told for amusement or emotional effect. So it was always intended for amusement rather than necessarily a serious or sacred story. To entertain others by telling a real life experience that you think other people will find enjoyable or interesting to listen to or read about. Sometimes people are using entertaining stories to help break down racial barriers that help explain practices or customs that might have seemed unusual or even scary to other people. The other thing is that sometimes you can be entertaining others to help them feel connected to you and to value you due to that connection. And because of that value, kind of people's attitude tends to change. Okay, so there's an article, the next few questions are going to be about a man named Alfred Scow and his book. I'm going to see if there's hang on, there it is. Sorry, I won't have time to read this entire thing, but this is on a site called, I think, Georgia Strait. BC Judge Alfred Scow, remembered as Aboriginal Pioneer, by Yolanda Cole on March 8th, 2013 at 2:38 p.m. This is a picture of him. This man was the very first Aboriginal lawyer to be called to the bar in British Columbia, and the very first Aboriginal judge in British Columbia as well. Kind, patient, helpful, widely admired, a man of many firsts, and an Aboriginal pioneer are some of the words and phrases used to describe the late Alfred Scow by those that knew him. The retired provincial court judge, who passed away on February 26 at the age of 86, was the first Aboriginal person to graduate from a BC law school in 1961, the first to be called to the bar in BC, and the first legally trained Aboriginal judge in the province. He was also a man who, even after he retired from the bench, like being a judge, dedicated his time to advancing and improving the position of Aboriginal people, according to lawyer Tina Dion, who worked with him for more than 15 years. What I've come to realize is that when Alfred puts his mind to something, he was fiercely determined to get the job done on one hand, yet on the other, he was a true diplomat who lived an extraordinary yet modest life. I think he exemplified in many respects integrity, patience, diligence, and the dignity of people and profession. He was truly a Canadian jewel. Hang on a sec. Scow was the recipient, of multiple accolades, including the Order of Canada, the Order of BC, and the Aboriginal Achievement Foundation Award. Okay? I'm going to skip ahead because I don't want to read the whole thing, but Aboriginal people were pretty much restricted from becoming lawyers until the mid-20th century. And in fact, First Nations people were not even allowed to hire lawyers to pursue cases against the Crown until around 1951. So him doing what he did basically opened possibilities to other people. And coincidentally, he has also written, or he's long gone, unfortunately, but also wrote a children's book about some of the things that happened in his life. So there is a YouTube link to a read aloud of his book, which was called The Secret of the Dance. It's a very common, very popular book. You might have seen it in your library as well. Take a look at the link. I'm going to kind of maybe quickly show you if I've got time. And think about, why were the children not allowed to attend the potlatch ceremony at the beginning of the book? So, hang on a second. So that's what you should see. Not able to watch the whole thing because YouTube kind of has a fit. It's not very long. You can see just 9 minutes. So take a look at that first and then come back and answer the questions. Hang on a sec. 7. How and why did things change about the potlatch from the time that Alfred Scow, when he was young, to when he became older? Pick any one of the page illustrations and describe it. What kind of emotions or atmosphere does the illustration help to get across that might not be conveyed in just the words of that page? Number 9, what are some important elements of your own culture that your family tried to preserve for you, or that you would like to preserve for the next generation? Why are those elements an important part of your heritage to you? Okay. With that, we are more or less finished. If you have any questions about this, by all means, call me. I'd be happy to talk to you. We have 2 more classes this week, and then we are going to have March break next week. Take care, and please reach out to me if you need help.